And I think at this point, I'll probably hand over to Kati, who I've known for a little while now, who is a company secretary in her own right. She's based in South Africa and has created her focus around the climate change task force reporting. Sorry, it keeps disappearing off my screen. Just bear with me a second. Let me just get that back. And why it is important to business to actually do the right thing in the first place, but the other part is to actually report on it accurately, because a lot of companies actually are doing some of these things, but they're actually not reporting on it in a way that they can gain the benefit or learn from and gain to do things in a better way. So I think the first point is maybe for Kati to just give us a little bit about herself in the process of starting up and giving us an introduction to the topic. And then she and I will have a conversation around a couple of things and tease out some of the issues. And then we will open questions to the floor and we will finish at 7 o'clock. So Kati, if I could hand over to you to say hello, explain who you are, and then you may proceed.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you for inviting me. Good evening, everybody. Lovely to see you. As Sharon said, I'm Kati Lewis. I am here from South Africa, Gqeberha, which is the previous Port Elizabeth. And I used to do a few things in my life. I lectured in law, practiced as an attorney and a conveyancer, and I was group company secretary in a listed environment for a number of years, and also responsible then for sustainability, with the idea of then starting my own firm, which I've now done. It's nearly 18 months. I can't believe how quickly time has flown. I do ESG, environment, social and governance, climate change, and water governance, and integrated reporting, you know, those good things which a company secretary is supposed to understand. So what we're going to talk about today is the TCFD, and I'll give you the detail of this at the moment. The problem with ESG is all these acronyms, so it gets really confusing if you're not familiar with these things. So if that's okay, shall I share my screen and then I can do a short presentation, and then we can have a better conversation after that.
You could do that, please, Keith.
Okay, please, if you can just tell me that I am sharing the right one. Can you see? Is my share?
Yes, it looks like the right one. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, so as I said previously, all of these acronyms are quite confusing. It took me forever to get this sorted. So I thought, let's just first start with the basics. What is TCFD? And it says it's the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So this is what we are going to talk about. And you will notice the important word here, financial, which we'll unpack in a while. So if I go to the agenda, I'd like to talk about briefly the history and what is the purpose of the TCFD. Then we have a look at the TCFD recommendations. And you are asking me, well, why are we talking about it? What does this mean to you? Why is it important? And then we can have a discussion. So let's have a look at the history and the purpose. So in 2015 already, which is quite a while ago, the FSB, the Financial Stability Board, established the TCFD at the request of the G20 leaders. And the main aim of the TCFD is to provide recommendations to businesses, to encourage voluntary, which is quite important, decision useful, must be consistent, comparable, reliable, and clear climate-related financial disclosures to the capital market. So you can see here it's got a very specific market. It's not all stakeholders, and it doesn't have the normal scope that ESG or sustainability will have. It's a very specific market, and these include lenders, insurers, and investors. So if we have a look at how this then progressed since 2015, in 2017, in July 2017, the final report was published. And the year thereafter, CDP, so now we've got another acronym, it used to stand for the Carbon Disclosure Project, and now it's just referred to as CDP, aligns to the TCFD. And this is quite an important milestone for reporting purposes. The CDP is the world's largest voluntary reporting platform, so to speak, for carbon disclosures. And there are thousands of companies reporting every year on their carbon, their water, and their forest activities. And the CDP is considered to be like the foundational framework for all things carbon. So this alignment was quite a definitive line in the sand. In 2019, we had the Network for Greening the Financial System formed, excuse me, which also endorsed the TCFD. So you can see the alignment happening. And then in 2020, the TCFD, 5 years thereafter, started publishing guidance notes and practices. What they found was that the companies understood that they had to report, and investors and asset managers and other financial market players also realized that they're sitting with something that they know intuitively and explicitly is important, but they don't quite know what to make of it and how to report and what to make of the information. So all of these guidances were published in the market. So also in 2021 was quite a big year, where 3 new guidance documents were released. And last year, I think, was the pivot when the TCFD became the basis for climate reporting in many jurisdictions. I want to actually go as far as to say most jurisdictions, including the UK as well, and we'll deal with that in a short while. So you can see how things are progressively stacking up. And if there is now one framework that you want to follow in all of these hundreds of frameworks available, it is definitely the TCFD for your reporting, not just for your climate, but also your ESG reporting. So having said that, let's have a brief look at the TCFD recommendations. Now, I'm appreciating that this can become quite technical, and I don't want to have like a information overload. I'm going to try to keep it as high level as possible, and we can then unpack it when we have a discussion, Sharon. Actually, when you have a look at it, you realize, oh, this makes a lot of sense. Just before I go into the TCFD recommendations, the TCFD committee comprises of about 32 people, individuals, and they are representative of industry, academia, the buy side, the sell side, the investor community. And when you look at the collective cognitive abilities and the intellectual capacity and capital, it's astounding. So what they did was they based the TCFD recommendations on international best practice already available. And the stance is, let's not reinvent the wheel. Let's see what is there and let's build on it and make it as practical and usable as possible. And hence all of this converged, and we have the TCFD recommendations only in 4 pillars. As simple as that, 4 pillars. I'm sure most of you would have seen this. Every article shows you this one. So you start off with the outer layer, which is the governance. And there you look at governance relating to climate-related risks and opportunities. So in other words, when you think of governance, and I mean, I'm speaking to company secretaries, this is like pop and wors, as we would say in Afrikaans. This is like, basics. It's all about your ethics. So in other words, the culture, how do you portray, how do you embrace it in your culture? And then also your tangibles, or then your framework. So that would be your processes, your structures, your agendas, your committees, etc. And there you have a look at the board and the board's oversight responsibilities, and you have management. So the delegated responsibilities of management, how does management implement and then report back to board? Next, we have the strategy. And here, when we think of strategy, you always have to keep in mind that the basics of the TCFD are the risks and opportunities. It also took me a while to figure out, what is this all about? And if you look at it from a risk and opportunity perspective, well, then this is going to be a breeze for you. Many people see the TCFD as purely risks, but that just gives you half of the picture because you have the flip side. And climate change is not, it is a huge risk. It's arguably the biggest global risk that we are facing, but it also presents itself with a lot of opportunity. So what you are looking at in this layer of the pillars, what are the actual as well as the potential? So you can see current and future looking potential impacts of these climate-related risks and opportunities on the business, on the company, but it unpacks it, not just the company, what about the company? So you want to understand its financial model, its financial planning, its business model, its strategy, and then the operations as well. So you can see it's really very wide how these risks and opportunities, the impacts thereof need to be considered. The third one is then your traditional risk management. As we all know, these are the processes that a company or an organization use to identify, assess, and manage your climate-related risks. And when we unpack the management, then in climate change, you break it down into how do you mitigate and how do you adapt. So mitigating is how do you reduce your carbon footprint, i.e. your physical greenhouse gas emissions, how can you reduce that? And everybody talks about the net zero targets and the journey to a just and low carbon future. Well, that's what we talk about. And then adaptation means those changes that have already happened because of climate change, where you have, for example, heat waves, you have droughts, you have floods, you have mudslides, and these kind of things. How do you adapt to that? Very sad in South Africa. We're in summer, as you know, so you must appreciate it that I've got my formal shirt on just for you. We had a heat wave, and it was so intense that people actually died because of it. And that is the reality of climate change. So now you ask yourself, how do we adapt and prevent all of these negative instances happening again? So now immediately you can think for yourself, if you have a business where your employees or your contractors are exposed to the elements, what are your heat management strategies, your hydration strategies, your mental health even, and all the rest of it. So this is a very significant thing to think about. In the last one, metrics and targets. Now, the difference between metrics and targets, you start off with your metrics. Once you've developed and identified, agreed on your metrics, you then set a target. So a metric is just a unit of measure. So you have different types of metrics. You can have an absolute one, you can have an intensity one. So it's understanding what is it that you measure. Is it, for example, just pure tons of CO2 equivalent? Or would it be tons of CO2 equivalent per pound revenue? Or is it per full-time employee? Or is it per container moved, or whatever it is? And then your target would be, how do you reduce your carbon footprint? How do you reduce the intensity, the carbon intensity of your procedures? How do you reduce or improve your resource efficiency? So there are many targets depending on the industry that you work in, and then also the sector that you have. So the purpose of the metrics are then to guide and assist the companies to assess and then manage your climate risks and opportunities, i.e., you've now said you were going to do this, you are now performing, so tell me how you are performing against these. Right. So the next key infographic in the TCFD recommendations would be this one, which sits beautifully on one page. We could actually spend the whole time just talking about this, but I will give you just a brief run through of what all of this means. So let's start at the left. You can see there we talk about, in the blue, you talk about the risks and you talk about the opportunities. As I said previously, when you think about TCFD, think risk and opportunities related to climate change. Then you break down the risks into two types or two buckets of risks. The first type of risk is what we call transition risks, or transitionary risks. As the word says, you're transitioning from one side to another. And in this instance, you are transitioning from your current business environment to a low carbon future, or you could be transitioning in regards to policy and legal requirements. Technology is transitioning. We all know that internal combustion engines are going to be something of the past, and you will either have fuel cells or you will have electric vehicles. That's a technological shift, not even a transition. The market is changing and your reputation as well. It's interesting to see when you register for webinars or conferences or so in relation to corporate governance. I've been speaking at corporate governance conferences for quite some time, and the focus has always been on governance or ethics or, you know, how do you deal with a board, and never were there any references to ESG, heaven forbid, anything about climate change. Now it's becoming a lot more common that people say, okay, well, what is this thing we call climate change governance? So here you can see, together with the market, your reputation will also change. If you are not aware of what is happening, if you are not advising your board, if your board is not taking the position as a leader and setting the direction of the company so that management can implement, well, then your reputation will definitely take a hit. So these are your transition risks. And then we have the physical risks, your acute risks or your chronic risk. An acute risk would be something like a flood or a mudslide or a hurricane. Hurricane Katrina would be a good example of a physical risk. What happened in Pakistan, where a third of the country was flooded, that is an acute risk. A chronic risk would be the most common physical chronic risk is your gradual increase in mean surface temperature. We all understand that to keep to the Paris Agreement, we have to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. We're doing a dismal job of that. That's chronic. Another chronic risk would be sea level rise. Some people think that droughts are chronic. Chronic droughts are more acute because the understanding is that a 2-year or a 3-year drought is more of an acute risk than a chronic risk, but that is also up for debate. As we said, we're in our 8th year of a very serious drought. For me, it feels more like chronic than acute. So yeah, we can talk about that. Then we move on to the opportunities, and this is where people can really spend a bit more time on understanding what they can do and not just see this as a risk and as a sort of a negative side of the coin. When you start investigating the things that you can do and the levers you can pull to address the impacts of climate change, the first one is obviously resource efficiency. Especially if you're in the manufacturing environment, improving the efficiency of the resources that you use has shown that not only does it make sense to do that from a carbon perspective, but it generally leads to a cost reduction. I have really not found any client or any business where they've improved their resource efficiency and it costs them more. It's normally a cost saving because you've got a better efficiency of what like, for example, water or waste or energy or something like that. And that is a financial benefit as well. And obviously your energy sources, we know that if we are all moving towards a low carbon future, well then solar, renewable energy, wind, hydro, all of these things. And that also has normally a financial benefit to a company. Your products and services, new companies are emerging, all based on the new low carbon future. So either you change your existing products or services, or you introduce new products and services to the market. Like, for example, an electric vehicle. Tesla, as you would have seen, have really done very well recently, despite a lot of comments made by its founder, but that's an example of a new product. Then obviously you've got new markets and you increase your resilience. So now you move down, now that you understand the risks and the opportunities, now you start looking at your strategic planning and your risk management. So what am I supposed to do with these risks? And your question is, for the purposes of the TCFD, it's all about the financial impact that climate change has on the business. So it's an outward-in approach. It's not what are the impacts that the company has on the environment. That's what we call double materiality for reporting purposes. I'm sure you're familiar with that. Here we are looking at pure financial materiality or the financial impact. And as you know, it impacts your income statement, your cash flow, and then your balance sheet or your, The balance sheet is then made up of your assets and liabilities. And here, for example, you would have your typical stranded assets or your impairment on your balance sheet or something like that. Equally so, your capital and financing, where you can, for example, receive a lower weighted average cost of capital, where you've got like a sustainability linked bond, you've got a climate change bond, you've got a green bond, and you benefit because of the process that you are taking towards a low carbon future, and the capital markets reward you for that. Then on your left-hand side, you will see their revenues. So in other words, you're now starting to distinguish between your normal revenues and your green revenues, and you also are distinguishing with regards to the expenditures. So in a very small nutshell, this is the model and the framework of the TCFD recommendations, how all of these fit together. I'm now going to move on to the importance of the TCFD to business, again, very high level. So firstly, the United Kingdom, the Financial Control Authority, climate-related disclosure requirements have now become compulsory, and you know you've got your different types of businesses. Your premium listed companies have been required to disclose climate and carbon for some time now, and they are progressively implementing the compulsory disclosure. I think it's by 2025, most companies will then have to report on climate. Again, the focus here is on financial materiality, and maybe if I can just recap the difference between financial materiality and double materiality. Financial materiality relates to all aspects which are material to the financial position and performance of the company, i.e., how does it impact the enterprise value of a company? That's financial materiality. When you look at double materiality, it's a combination of financial materiality as well as what we call societal impact materiality. So now that's an inside out. So in other words, you want to understand what are the impacts that the company has on society and the natural environment. And the combination of the two are what we call double materiality. And this is a very important aspect. People have huge debates, and all the different integrated reporting frameworks and standard setters are debating this at length. Should it be double materiality? Should it be financial materiality? You will see when I move on to the slide how that changes. Importantly for the United Kingdom, this is TCFD aligned, and hence this is also a reason why we're having this webinar. So if you now look at the European Union, look at the interesting distinction. The European Union is by far the front runner in all things climate-related disclosure as well as ESG-related. They have a double materiality approach. So if you are subject to European Union reporting, that means you do not only report on how do the impacts of climate change impact the company, both from a risk and an opportunity perspective, but equally so, you have to explain to your stakeholders, not just your shareholders and the capital markets. It's a much broader audience. So you have to report to your key stakeholders how the company is also impacting the society and the natural environment. So you can see how quite vastly the reporting scope changed. And as you know, the European Union, last year was also a big year for the European Union. The European Sustainability Reporting Standards are being finalized, and the directive has been issued, the final version to be confirmed later in this year. So if we move then on to international reporting, I'm sure everybody is very well versed in IFRS accounting. And as you know, you've got your IAS, your International Accounting Standards. And at COP26 in Glasgow the year before last, the ISSB was established and it was created. So that stands for the International Sustainability Standards Board. What that means is that the IFRS Foundation is in the process of finalizing. They've released the exposure drafts last year already. And later this year, in September, if I'm not mistaken, the final version will be released. And there are two exposure drafts, S1 and S2. So the first one, S1, is the general requirements for sustainability-related financial information. And please note financial. So they also follow a financial materiality approach, where it's all things sustainability related. The second one, S2, is specifically climate-related disclosures. The importance of this is that IOSCO, the Institute or the International Organization of Securities Commission, which covers more than 130 jurisdictions, is working towards reviewing these disclosures with a view of endorsing this. Once they've endorsed it, that means more than 130 jurisdictions of stock exchanges will most likely incorporate it into their listing requirements. That is a big thing. That means accounting standards and sustainability standards are going to be level pecking. So you can no longer just report on financial matters. You will have to now incorporate sustainability as well as climate-related disclosures in your annual financial statements and your filings. And again, the TCFD recommendations are incorporated. In fact, they use it as the basis. So in the United States, it was a very big event. The year before last, they proposed a new rule, 506 pages long rule. Bottom line, they are going to mandate climate-related disclosure requirements. It's also on a financial materiality basis, and it is also based on the TCFD. Having said that, chances are like virtually certain that litigation will occur, but it seems like the SEC is back on track. They lost a few months due to some glitches, etc. But the market is already preparing for the compulsory disclosure in relation to climate information. So you can see what I'm saying is the train has left the station, and it is vitally important for companies, not just companies, but investors and asset managers to get on board and to start understanding what all of this means. So importance to business, having now understood the greater environment. There are there are many, but I'm just going to focus on 6 of these important aspects. So first of all, even though the TCFD is a voluntary framework, more and more jurisdictions are making it compulsory. And as I said previously, in the UK, it's already been compulsory since 2021, and the other companies will follow. I attended a webinar the day before yesterday, and the chairperson of IOSCO was on the panel, and he was saying that IOSCO is contemplating recommending the IFRS standards for reporting as soon as 2024. That means companies need to start reporting for the financial year 2024. So that's next year. So that means companies need to have their systems, their processes, their procedures, their data gathering systems in place because the year thereafter, they have to start reporting. And what that also means is that they've decided to include scope 3 emissions. Now, if I can just take one step back, I know I'm getting a little bit technical, but you've got scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Scope 1 emissions are those emissions which are as a result of your direct operations. So you're in direct control of these emissions. Scope 2 are your indirect emissions, and those are from electricity sources. So in the case of South Africa, that would be Eskom, which is fossil fuel based. And then scope 3 would be all your other indirect emissions. That means upstream and downstream of your supply chain. They've included scope 3. Nobody thought that that was going to happen. This is how serious it is. So it's not just to say that you have to get a grip on your operations. You have to get a grip on the data of your supply chain as well. So you can understand that there was quite a big hoo-ha in the market. Secondly, risk mitigation. It gives you the ability to better understand, to identify, to mitigate, and to manage your climate-related risks as a financial risk for your long-term sustainability. And from an investor perspective, well, you know, information is what we need, and that's why the basis of the TCFD is it must be decision useful. There's no sense in having information if you can't do anything with it. And that's what they keep on hammering all the time is give me information that I can use and that I can make better decisions and better investments. So that's all about the allocation of capital. And you will have a competitive advantage. Standard & Poor's credit ratings have already incorporated the TCFD recommendations. The Bank of England and PwC, you can imagine the research going on. They've showed positive correlations between stock price and TCFD disclosures. So if you follow the research, the majority of research shows a positive correlation between entrenched sustainability practices and financial performance. However, there are other pieces of research out there that says, no, there is no such thing. But when you have a look at the research which shows the correlation and also the indices, etc., for me, it's very clear which side I lean towards. Then lastly, also the liability of organizations and directors. It limits your exposure of litigation. So Norton Rose attorneys they've got a fantastic website and they keep track of climate change litigation. And if I now remember my numbers correctly, it's more than 1,400 cases. Currently, I'm really not that good with numbers, but currently in relation to climate change litigation, and it's increasing steadily. Every year there's been more cases. It's not dropped since they started evaluating this. And Sharon, that is my story.
Wow.
Yeah, I don't know if I went over time, apologies, but this is the discussion, and thank you.
Absolutely no problem.
I can stop sharing then.
I found that absolutely stimulating and interesting. It did raise a couple of questions in my mind, and I'm going to sort of be a little how off the mark in some of the questions I'm going to ask, because I know this is to a degree a feeling you might see out there. This is a tick box exercise. I'm wasting resources. I'm costing money. I'm adding no value. Can you hear the messages that you're getting from the naysayers within the community, the company, wherever it may be coming from? If you were in the shoes of the CEO speaking to their team or stakeholders, or the chairman talking to the board or stakeholders, how would you respond to this kind of, I haven't got onto the journey yet, so I don't understand it because it looks like a waste of time to me, the uninitiated?
Yes, no, that's a very good question. And I dealt with that in my corporate experience as well. I've always been a little bit of a, saving the planet kind of person. And especially in certain industries where you've got a high impact industry, people would say, but you know what, for example, coal is the basis of my business. Now you come with climate change, please don't waste my time. So the first thing that I would say is, well, I was actually having this conversation with my husband just before this call. Whether you like it or not, whether you believe in it or not, whether you believe climate change is real or not, if you're that 3% of the scientific community that thinks it's a hoax, you are welcome to your views. Legislation and regulations are going to force you to report. And if you don't do something about it, you do not have something to report on. If you do not comply, well, you will be out of business in no time. So, number one, it is going to become a compliance issue. There are now more than, it's double digits now, the jurisdictions where it's already compulsory or it's becoming compulsory. As soon as IOSCO endorses the IFRS Foundation sustainability and climate related standards, it's going to happen. I don't need a crystal ball to make such a bold statement. The only thing I don't know is when, but whether it's going to happen or not, that's definitely one. And then secondly, business is all about risk and opportunity, right? I mean, you've got to take risks to make money. That's a good thing. But you don't want to take risks to such an extent where you become irresponsible and, you lose everything. This is a risk. It touches your financial ability. Oh, Gabrielle, I'll give you a second now.
Yeah,
So,
I'll come back to Gabrielle when I've asked a few questions myself, Gabrielle.
Oh, okay.
So wait
Okay.
patiently. I won't forget you. I see you there already.
Okay. So it just makes a lot of sense. You are doing yourself a favor to increase your risk management and to understand what is happening. So, I would say just those two, all the other 6 issues that I've raised as well. There was a very interesting article that I read. There was recently research conducted. Do you know 20% of employees in the UK will refuse a job if the company does not have a climate policy or an ESG policy? 20%. So you're going to lose your talent and you won't be able to retain your talent. If I think of how my daughter thinks, she's obviously a young adult. She said to me, Mom, if I don't understand what the social impact of a company is, I will not work for that. You will not get my talent, you will not get my input. So you're not going to sit with really good employees, and you know that your employee base is the heart of your company. So, yeah.
Interesting. When Katya and I were younger, it was difficult enough for a woman to get a job, least of all for us to define how the company had to define its policy to its stakeholders. Just another question, you brought this up again in the answer to the previous one, Kati, is many companies are global. Compliance departments have to be global. Governance departments within organizations have to be global. How does, let's say, a UK-based holding company with operations in all the territories you've just referred to, and we then have to look at how do we not gold plate all the whole organization to adapt to everybody's policy? So I've got one version for the company. How do I manage in-country compliance and therefore reporting to the board of the holding company up through the structure? How would you advise that governance compliance conundrum and tension that exists within the organization?
It's a wonderful question. And that is arguably the key question that all the people responsible for drafting the standards and the frameworks, IFRS, GRI, SASB, the whole caboodle, and there are many frameworks. There are like hundreds of frameworks out there, you know that, and methodologies and so on. And there are now memorandums of understanding and cooperation signed between the big 5 standard settings, and you know that they've started to converge, where you've now got the Value Reporting Foundation, etc. So they understand this irritation, both from a company perspective and from an analyst and a shareholder perspective, and they are converging the standards. So again, I reiterate that the IFRS Foundation standards is going to be the global baseline. So my suggestion would be if you follow the TCFD, you will definitely be okay, because everything is based on the TCFD. And you can see it's not difficult. I mean, if you can read, you can get there, right? 4 principles. Okay, there are 11 recommendations. You just need to sort of work at it until you get it. But it's not
Own
50.
Kati.
Or that.
Yeah.
And so first of all, TCFD, get yourself familiar with that, or get someone who can help you with that. And then secondly, if you follow the IFRS Foundation standards, it's out, and I follow it quite closely. And I'm, you know, as I said, I can see where they're going. They're not really going to change much to the exposure draft, which for me is quite exciting. And it gives a lot of certainty. So you know what to expect. It's not going to be meeting by ambush. You're not going to wake up one morning and go like, oh my word, I didn't know this is going to happen. It's there. You need to read it. You need to get familiar, and you need to get your processes in place, because it is quite cumbersome, especially the scope 3. As I said previously, I was very surprised with the scope 3. I didn't think that they were going to do that, but there you go.
Yeah.
So
Well, that's one of the things they obviously learned from the King 4 regulation, because that's one of the few governance codes that requires you to go into the supply chain to the extent that they require, which, for example, our code doesn't. So unfortunately, they've been learning from people who know how it should be done, but it does make it very complex. Before I ask another question, we do run out of time. I'm actually going to turn to Gabrielle and then to James.
Thank you. And Kathy, don't worry, you're preaching to the converted, and I thoroughly enjoyed that. But there's one thing I'm not quite sure about that you may be able to shed some light on, because in my previous role looking after pension trustees, where we were looking at ESG, we found it very hard to really get to grips with the indices that were used in evaluating performance against ERG, and that was an ongoing discussion for many months about, you know, the differences in the indices, and I'm not quite sure, has that been ironed out? Can you look at different indices and you're actually getting apples for apples?
the answer is no. So if you have a
Sadly.
look at I'm sorry, I wish I could give you a different answer, but they are very aware of it. But there's a big difference, Gabrielle, between the raters and the rankers, or the indices, and then the reporting frameworks and standards. The frameworks and the standards are having a concerted effort to converge, and that's happening, and I can see it. And if you follow, as I said, those two, TCFD and the IFRS, by and large, you'll be okay. But if you are in a jurisdiction where you have double materiality, remember, you have to now have the inward-out approach as well. So in other words, your impact. That's the only big caveat that I have. When you look at your indices, your raters and your rankers, like, for example, the Dow Jones, you've got Sustainalytics, and there are many of them. My suggestion is pick your poison, because you are never going to be all things to all men. And, you know, I have a different view. I like the way that the methodologies are different. Look at FTSE Russell, FTSE for Good. There are so many of them. Each one has got a different slant and a different thing which is important, and a different methodology. And that's good. I mean, look at the people on this call. We can't be all the same. We can't think the same. We can't, you know, live the same lives. That's why you've got different methodologies. Some are more suited to some industries. Some are more suited to the culture of the company. Get yourself up to speed with the basics of what they are. Decide which one works for you, and then adjust it. But always first choose your framework and your standard, and then the raters and the rankers. I mean, obviously they would disagree with me, but I have seen where companies are trying to, for example, comply with 5 or 6 of them. I mean, we all read integrated reports, right? And then they have that page to say, we've got all of these rankings, and their disclosure and sustainability crew are so exhausted, they can't even remember their own names. And I'm like, you know, you get to a point where so much effort, and what is the added value? Decide where you want to be, and be very deliberate about why you are reporting, why is it important, and the so what does it change that. And the last thing that I want to say is make sure that your internal reporting and your external reporting are aligned. Your board reporting, going to Exco, going to board, all your committees, do you have the same indices and indicators? You will be surprised when I ask companies, clients this, they're like, no, we don't talk about this in our management meeting, but you're reporting on this in your integrated report. Wow, how does that work? So there's a misalignment. Make sure you've got your alignment, and then use the raters and rankers as a guidance. Don't let that be, I don't want to say the boss of you, but you understand what I mean. Just, yeah.
Yeah, it is difficult though. And it's certainly difficult for people like pension trustees, because
Correct.
they've got lots of investments and each investment manager is giving them different rankings. So
Yeah.
they, and their heads are the ones on the block. So, but that's
Yeah.
very interesting. And I like the way you, thank you for explaining, go back to the the
Thanks
first.
for being practical. That's the
Yeah,
part I
exactly.
appreciate.
Yeah,
Before we
thanks a
run
lot.
out of time,
Thanks
let's
a lot.
ask James for his question.
Yeah, thanks. And I know where Gabrielle is coming from, and the answer is some of it's greenwashing, Gabrielle. So that's just me being cynical, but I think it is. I mean, the recommendations themselves, have the feel of being written by accountants, because they are almost a tick box in terms of the way they're constructed. And we as governance professionals actually know that that's not good. Tick boxing is not good governance. Good governance goes much, much deeper than that. So the question I'd ask is one, is there a requirement on auditors to evidence that the statements that companies make in relation to these disclosures are actually real and operate effectively through their organizations? And are there ways in which companies who really do take this seriously and really do, manage their governance frameworks so that climate is constantly being looked at by all levels of the organization in terms of decision making? Is there a way in which they can demonstrate themselves to be, if you like, better or more effective at this than other places?
I so like your question, James, and that's a bugbear that I have as well. Way back when we still had King 3, I don't know if any of you have that terrible nightmare. I mean, it was like 74, 75. The principles and the practices were all in between. And you literally had to do a tick box. And you had to say yes, yes, yes. And I had to do that every year. My word. Thank goodness that's done. So it's not helpful, right? Because why are you doing it? It's just like window dressing, and you don't achieve anything. If you look at the TPI, the Transition Pathway Initiative, I love their work. They distinguish between the governance and the implementation. And that's also why I have a little bit of a problem with CDP and these raters and rankers, because you get a tick. For example, if they say, do you have a policy? Yes. But you could have an absolute disastrous policy that doesn't say anything, it doesn't add anything. They measure the activity, they don't measure the outcome or even the impact where they should be measuring, right? So on your value creation model, you've got it all wrong. You start here, you should be here at the end of your model. So the question should actually be, how has, since you've implemented the policy, changed your stakeholders and the way you do business? That should be the question. And give me an example of how your governance is better, how your decision-making is better, how you've reduced your risk, how you've adapted, etc. So there are some international best practices like the TPI, which distinguishes between it. So you do get, yes, you've got a policy, that's good, but that's just baby steps. But now it's like, show me, and show me from a carbon point of view, it's, well, look at the scoreboard. How does your carbon footprint look like? Because that, at the end of the day, is what carbon reporting is all about. Have you reduced your intensity, and have you reduced your absolute carbon footprint? And the reason why I like the TCFD, I use it for everything, the philosophy and the methodology, is because it helps with systems thinking. I'm a big believer in systems thinking. You know, we don't live in isolation, and all of these things are connected. If you understand how governance works, you know that you cannot have well-entrenched governance if it doesn't roll over to your risk management, for example, and it doesn't affect your strategy, and it doesn't affect your stakeholder engagement. I mean, these are obvious things, right? So it's understanding how all of these impact. Practical example as a company secretary. So now we say, how do the climate change risks and opportunities impact your business model? So let's take Sasol. I'm sure you're all familiar with Sasol. It's making synfuels and so on in South Africa. They like huge carbon footprint. Sasol understands that if they don't change their business model, not just strategy, but their business model, soon they will be out of business. So they get it. What are they doing? They've used governance by creating a committee, both on board level and on management level. So now you can see how governance is working. They've got risk management on an Uber version where you've now got your climate risk management integrated into your ERM. So now climate change affects your financial planning when you allocate capital. So now how it's supposed to work in practice is, say you've got your capital applications and your investment committee, right? Your standard paper that goes to your investment committee, we all know how that looks, your internal rate of return, your financial model, but it's only financial. As soon as you introduce a carbon price, everything changes. That's a practical way in which you move from a tick box to real life. Now, all of a sudden, you are competing internally for capital, not just on a financial basis, but on a carbon basis. You can have more fun and you can put a price on water. Imagine that. If you have a water intense project, no longer going to work, sorry, it's off the table. I'm not going to fund that project. So that's an example of how you do it. Metrics and targets. You set your targets and you start integrating that in your internal reporting, flowing over to your external reporting. I hope that helps, James, to give you an idea of how to move away, but it takes time. And, you know, it's difficult to inculcate it into like the DNA of the business, you know, changing the way that you actually think about things.
That's precisely my point, is I think as a governance professional in your position, you can identify all sorts of weaknesses, but actually you can still tick the boxes. And, you know, what position are you in to influence the outcome? You know, and that's the difficulty, because you've actually got to persuade the boards to actually live the values if they're adopting climate change as one of their values. And, you know, sometimes in some businesses, that's not very easy. But from a practical point of view, the easy thing to do is just tick the boxes.
Well, if you can convince your remuneration committee to include climate change or decarbonization as a big part of the incentive bonus, you're okay. Money make people smile.
I have been involved with health and safety years and years ago, where we had to get it inculcated into the way we did things. And you're absolutely right. We did it through the senior bonus scheme. Yeah. And there are people who don't agree with that, but actually it worked.
If you measure it, it will happen.
Yeah, it worked.
And if you measure it with their income, it will happen faster.
I have one quick question, because I know Sharon's going to shut us down, but London says, you know, we are insuring the world. I think they said it this week. Now, actually, we have a position in England where they no longer insure certain people's homes because of flooding. Where are we going with that? Because the insurers have taken such a huge hit in London on some of the climate aspects. You know, where they're not works of God or whatever, you know, acts of God. And do we think actually we're going to get a position where things just aren't insurable?
100%. We're seeing it in South Africa now. I don't know whether you followed the news. with those huge
Yep.
mudslides in KZN. Some of my friends lost their houses. It was dreadful. So the insurance is either going to become, either your assets will become uninsurable,
Uninsurable, yeah.
uninsurable, thank you for that, or you will have such high premiums that you cannot afford it. One of the examples is happening in California right now, where you now have climate migrants. Real life, people had to move because they couldn't afford the insurance premiums on their houses because of the wildfires in California. So if I were in the insurance game, I would be very worried. And the insurers and the reinsurers, I mean, that's what they worry about by and large, is the impact of climate change. And when you get to the point where you talk about hard and soft adaptation, where you get to the point of hard adaptation, where you can't adapt anymore because it is what it is. And you reach certain tipping points. And again, remember, your earth systems are all interconnected. And the one thing is going to lead to the other. You've got heat waves, droughts, and then Italy runs out of water. The Rhine, ships can't travel on the Rhine because of the drought. I mean, these are knock-on effects which people didn't even foresee. But when you take a step back and when you look at it, you realize, well, it was actually foreseeable, because that is what happens when you've got high temperatures and no rain. Then these things are going to happen. So insurance, they are very worried about this.
And they go through decades where one time it's all about earthquakes, next time it's something else. It's a very difficult industry when you think about it. And the hope is they have enough people relative to those that bring the risks and the outcomes. Just one very small, quick question, and then we'll just have an informal. Have you got 10 minutes to stay with us or not? I can't remember. I know we did discuss this, Kati.
Yes, I'm fine.
You got 10 more minutes. Okay. So if we just take, I am a consultancy business. If I were innocent, I'd say, but I sit at my desk at home and I don't have a carbon footprint. Okay, I'm being innocent. Then you get a manufacturing plant or a big global agribusiness that's moving fruit or wheat or something around the world. That big business or that manufacturing concern or that carbon footprint of moving things physically around the world, there's elements there that even the uninitiated would understand. How does the average small business take this on board in a way that they have an impact? Because if all of them do it, because we know that 92% of the companies in the UK, I think, are SMEs. So
Yes.
how do we, all of us, in our small way, make a real difference?
Good question. So I'm going to go back to scope 1, 2, and 3.
Mhm.
So those
Oh,
things.
so was I not listening?
No, you were, absolutely, but I'm using that as an example. So scope 1, what is within my direct control? And there are lovely platforms and websites and so on available that you can use. So you calculate your own footprint. So like my personal footprint, I nearly had a cadenza because I used to travel all the time from Durban to PE. Now I don't do that. So I had a big carbon footprint. You take certain decisions and you reduce your footprint. So if you're office-based, your direct footprint will be low, but there are always things that you can do. What are you doing about your water? Because remember, water and waste also counts toward your carbon footprint because, again, everything is connected. Waste is your scope 3. And because water and climate change are so integrally connected, what you do with water will impact carbon and other way around. So what are your water stewardship principles, your waste and your carbon? What type of energy are you using? What is your energy efficiency? And you will be surprised when you start stacking them up. You get excited and you realize, oh my word, this is working. And progressively you become more confident and you can start seeing the difference. And it is possible then to reduce it. I think the biggest area for opportunity would be in your scope 3, your supply chain, i.e., what type of products do you buy in your business? what type of questions are you asking people? If you, for example, have DHL, are they using internal combustion engines or are they using electric vehicles? Do you have a choice of using a different supplier? Do you have a choice of the packaging that you buy? The paper that you use, are you digital or are you still paper-based? So you see, if you start seeing it from that side, what is the impact of your product or service? Do you understand the residual carbon once you've used it? I mean, coal is the perfect example. The biggest bulk of carbon is burning coal, and that's where it is in scope 3, right? It's not scope 1 and 2. So if you start understanding what you are dealing with and you start unpacking it, you will be surprised how many things there are that you can do. There are quick wins, and some of them are not even expensive, but you do get to a stage where you then say, okay, I'm at a tipping point. Do I want to spend a lot of capital or not? So then it becomes more of a deliberation as to what you want to do.
That's so
So
interesting.
That is, so,
Kathy.
it's fascinating that
Yeah.
you can do it. But now I look at South Africa, and I mean, some of these people on the call probably don't know the extent that South African homes at the moment are suffering between 11 and 15 hours a day without electricity. The carbon footprint of the country must have come down dramatically.
Mm.
They're now into batteries and all sorts of other solutions to try and stay alive from a business and a home perspective. But that's more a tongue-in-cheek comment than it is anything of value to anyone. Anybody got any last questions?
No, I'd just like to say in my last company, we did exactly what you were saying, Kathy. We looked at our what we were buying in terms of electricity and gas, and we registered how green they were, or what the carbon footprint was, and we analyzed that, and and it was only one meeting a year before we placed our contract. We could renew our contract if we were happy with it, and we got consultants to crunch the numbers for us. And actually, it was a very efficient thing because we got our prices down, but also kept it as green as possible by just putting in that bit of effort.
Correct. And you will see that it will result in a cost saving as well. So it makes absolute business sense.
Yeah. Thank you ever so
Interesting.
much.
James, if we go back to the conversation we had at F&GP the other day, where we got that feedback on the investments, I think someone like those three could do with learning a little bit from this conversation, because they didn't have a fraction of Kati's insight and natural knowledge. I would put them into the greenwashing statements because they didn't understand the underlying or where to even begin with it. That was my gut feeling.
Yeah, I think that's a little harsh, actually. To say the least. They're not doing what Kathy's trying to do.
No,
I mean,
no.
they're not governance professionals trying to report on their business and get the right disclosures in order to comply with the rules. What they're doing is they're doing the other thing, is they're actually looking at the companies, looking at the disclosures those companies have made and determining what validity they have.
Mhm.
And that was around my earlier question here, is that is that people are box ticking, and really, if you're an investment manager and actually climate change is something that matters to your client, you need to be testing the disclosures in order to evidence the fact that they really do live and breathe them. They're not just ticking the boxes, and I think that's the challenge. I actually think personally that the ESG part of what Bruins do is probably the best bit. It's the rest of it that's not so brilliant. but it's a different thing, and I think
It is a
difficult to
different
compare the
place.
two.
But interesting, and it's good that you're defending them because it makes me feel better. But I didn't feel that the individuals giving the feedback on the questions knew enough about our investments and this issue. Now, I may be completely wrong, but I didn't sense a comfort from them. The organization might have that content. I didn't feel we had a good content at the presentation level. But anyway, we're off topic anyway.
No, but I think it's fair comment. But I mean, one of the observations I'd make is that, various bits of research are done, particularly on retail investors. And the reality is that this issue comes bottom of their investment criteria. It is quite extraordinary how low down it actually is. It's professional investors that are driving this agenda. Retail investors, oh, yes, it's okay. But if it impacted their returns, they don't want to know. End of discussion. So, I think a lot of investors are slightly sort of schizophrenic on the subject, but they are obliged to follow it, and professional investors like us are asking them the questions, so they have to be able to answer them. And I thought Bruins did a reasonable job at answering this particular question. I didn't think they did a good job answering on others, but that's just a personal view.
Interesting, Kati, one of our South Africans has just dropped off the call because one of the children turned off the inverter while they were in load shedding and apologizes, but she's only just dropped off literally 5 minutes ago, 6 minutes ago. But there's an example of sort of one of the hazards we have to suffer in the South African environment. I'm going to call this to a close by saying, Kati, that was absolutely fascinating. And I think the practical insights you gave us of how each one of us can make a difference, because big companies, they've got teams of people starting to do this way down the journey already if they're fortunate at having got going early. But so many of us individuals are not as up that journey as we could be. And feedback that I've just received on one of the feedback from somebody who was on the call a little earlier, saying, I had no idea I could make so much difference.
Huge amount. Every day, I promise you, every day, if you take a different decision, you will have an impact. So I deliberately think about it. For example, we have a beautiful farm stall in Delhi, 2 minutes down the road. I buy individual potatoes. So no packaging. And, I'm trying to reduce my waste. And you can buy honey by the jar. And if you think about it, so we've invested, we've got solar on the roof, best thing ever, living in South Africa. So I don't have any hassle with electricity, but imagine how that reduces. If you think about, do you need to drive your car? Can you share, ride sharing, or so many different decisions that you can take, and it all adds up. I don't eat meat. Meat has got a huge carbon footprint. 1 kilogram of beef uses 50,000 liters of water. There's no way I can eat meat after I know this. So I stopped eating meat when I heard this. It's a big sacrifice.
I was talking to somebody today about what are habits. And you can't change a habit unless you change your DNA and your thought processes. You've just given an example where instantly you can stop doing something. Like if somebody's pregnant, they can instantly change their ways. If they hear about something like that, they can change their ways. But there are others who, that thing is, we can't change something unless we want to. I think we're down to that as a closing comment. Thank you for those who have stayed on with us and have seen Kati right to the end. I really appreciate it. It's been really interesting. And there will be lots of views of this because we're going to push this out on social media because it really, really was interesting. Some people might have thought it a bit dry, but my goodness, it's anything but.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're really welcome. Thank you. It was such a pleasure.
Really enjoyed it.
And James is our master, so he's the most senior person in our company. So now he knows what he's got to do differently. Don't ask us to come to meetings. Our carbon footprint's too expensive. And Keith, as secretary, thank you, or as clerk, thank you so much for running this for us. And Karen, you arranged everything in the background. Could never do without you guys. Thanks a million.
And thanks, Sharon, for setting it up.
Yeah, very good. Very
you.
interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.
You're a star.
Bye.
See you in 2 weeks' time if I can.
For sure.
All the best. Cheers, everyone.